Hello, everyone. My name is Khalil. I'm a fourth-year undergraduate here at the University of Toronto, and I'm very excited today to be talking a little bit about my recently published paper in the Yale Review of International Studies, YRS. And first and foremost, before proceeding, I want to say a big thank you to the IR Society for having me, for giving me this platform as well to discuss my work in greater detail. And so without further ado, let's hop into some of these questions here. First one is just to talk a little bit about my research and how I got started. And so firstly, the title of the paper is called Capitalist Racism, a Contemporary Analysis on W.E.B. Du Bois's Color Line and Double Consciousness Through Canadian Diamond Mining and Economic Activity in Angola. So that's a little bit of a mouthful there. And there was definitely a lot to unpack throughout this paper. And so what I aimed to do was take two frameworks from two different texts and kind of fuse them into this contemporary analysis on how Canada is acting in a neo-colonial manner within Angola. And so those two texts, the first one was W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, written in the earliest 20th century, and where he talks about the color line and double consciousness, with the color line alluding to, these socioeconomic, sociopolitical barriers that exist amongst different racial groups, how that connects in conjunction with class as well. And then I also looked at a more contemporary text by Canadian author Paula Butler. Her 2015 work titled Race in Canadian Mining in Contemporary Africa gave a lot of insight into how Canada was operating in different countries within the African continent, namely Sierra Leone and Angola. Angola was a great case study because it had the backdrop of the Civil War, in which diamonds were a huge tool for economic advantage. And even succeeding that Civil War, there continues to be this neo-colonial hold in Angola, primarily by different actors such as Canada, with their diamond industry. And the blood diamonds that exist, or so they are categorized and continue to be categorized as such in Angola, have created a lot of political, economic, and social turmoil in the country that has just been exacerbated by Canadian privatized companies coming in and exploiting this industry. And so I really aim to tackle this preconceived notion that Canada is this all-encompassing, diverse state that promotes inclusivity and equality. And that is not to say that we do not, but there are also, it has been evident through, domestic issues such as how we've dealt with the indigenous population, as well as now abroad through foreign issues such as the ones in Angola, that those positive connotations that are attached to Canada are not always the case and can be found to be untrue in these particular situations. And I really wanted to have a look at how Canada is going about promoting those aforementioned connotations of itself, and yet engages in such hypocritical behavior in Angola. That was a big goal of mine to kind of explore in this paper and really look at how things within the diamond industry have translated into capitalist racism, the intersectionality of, or exacerbating that intersectionality of race and class, and how these neoliberal structures promoted by Canada continue to be a nuisance in Angola. And that was a big part of my intrigue into writing this paper. And that brings us to our second question, which is to talk a little bit about some of the unexpected hurdles or successes that I encountered in the process of working on this particular piece. So one of the hurdles that I encountered quite early on was the ways in which to piece all of this work together, all of the research that I found, because I was trying to combine the work of W.E.B. Du Bois with Paula Butler's in an attempt to prove the multidimensional forms of discrimination that were happening within Angola, and to highlight the intersectionality of race and class. And then I wanted to look at the ways in which the Angolan Civil War, the Fowler Report in 2000, and then the Kimberley process all had their different impacts on where this industry is currently and how Canada has positioned itself to exploit it accordingly. So there was a lot of moving parts, and initially it took a lot of time to sit down and analyze the way in which I would structure this in order to be coherent and fluid and to make a compelling argument that wouldn't be lost in everything that I was trying to write about and these different parts that had to be elaborated on. And so that was definitely a big initial challenge, and I'm glad that I was able to piece it all together in the long run. I think that was definitely a personal success of mine, because at times I thought about whether I was doing too much, but it was also important that I had a narrowed scope of Angola and Canada and focusing on those two, because had I extended it, to a continental type of lens in which I looked at, Africa as a whole or North American activity as a whole, I don't think the paper would have been as strong. And it was definitely the concentration of the bilateralism of Angola and Canada and their relations in this particular industry that helped make the paper that much more convincing in terms of the realities of what Canada was engaging in, or continues to engage in, I should say. And so that hurdle gradually turned into a success along the way, which was great. And of course, the biggest success was getting that acceptance from YRIS for publication on a personal note, because that was my first ever academic publication. And so, it was a great validation of the work that I had done on this paper. And it was just equally as great to see it all come together and to almost have a tangible recognition of what I aimed to talk about in the paper, and what I hoped would continue conversation outside or beyond the paper. And YRIS turned out to be a great platform in which to do this. And that leads us more so into this third question here, which is, how do I select journals to submit my work to? And I have to give full disclosure in that I wasn't actively looking to submit my work to a journal per se, and that when I got the paper back from my professor in Paul 380, for which I'd written the paper for, I'd gotten great feedback on it, and I was definitely proud of the piece because I thought it was contemporary and very prevalent to back at the beginning stages of the pandemic, when we had a lot of turmoil, particularly in the United States as well, when we talk about racial discrimination. So it was very prevalent, and I was very glad to have raised awareness on what role Canada plays as well. And having gotten that paper back, it wasn't too long after when I got an email about the Yale Review of International Studies, YRIS, and they were accepting submissions from undergrads all over the world. And I thought, why not bet on myself and see where it goes? And so I hadn't even thought about, in the event that I would be selected and accepted, what publication would look like. But I mainly wanted to get my paper out there and hopefully have somebody else read it and resonate or be intrigued and continue the conversation. That was, I think, the biggest part for me when submitting to YRIS. And so that's, those were the main motivations for that. And beyond the Yale Review of International Studies, I did not submit my piece to any further journals. or at least as yet. And that, I suppose, is also in part due to the acceptance that I received from Virus at the end of July, which was a really big highlight. And so that brings us now into this fourth and final question, which is about some of the behind the scenes insight into the publishing process and what kind of went down between the acceptance of being published to the final publication of the piece. And so, yeah, when I accepted it, we followed that by 3 rounds of editing before it was finally published in late September. And the first round was definitely the round in which the most edits were made in terms of whether it be syntax and different fragments of sentence structure, whether it was to, maybe make a certain part more succinct, elaborate here. And then the second and third rounds were much more minimal, and it was more so just polishing the paper, making sure the choice of diction was correct in each area, and that everything flowed well. And what I really enjoyed about working with the editors at Virus for this piece was that the originality of the piece and my voice in the paper remained intact, and that it didn't change. There weren't whole scale changes to the paper. The length of the paper was not altered, and so those were all positives for me, because I had previously not worked with editors or had a piece published, so it was a new experience for myself. And I was glad to know, at least in this particular scenario, that the core content of my paper and the message I aimed to portray and the argument I wanted to make remained intact the whole way through. And it was great because it was always, throughout the 3 rounds, they always let me know, when they were editing, it would come back to me and I would have the final say over, yeah, I agree with this edit, or not so much, I think we should do this instead, or this is why I think it should remain this way in terms of the bigger picture of the paper. And so that was great to still have that autonomy over my work and being able to just have a great ongoing dialogue with the editors in terms of what works, what doesn't work so much. And that was, a great success as well, I think, in terms of the publication process with the paper. And I definitely think that the publication was a really great way to, of course, have exposure for the paper and my work, but ultimately it's also of paramount importance that this sort of rhetoric that I write about reaches as many people as it can. I think that was the biggest success when I look back on retrospect, is that I was able to have a platform such as Virus to advocate for my work and to highlight it on a scale that would not have been able to be reached without publication, because I definitely think it's a worthwhile conversation on the ways in which Canada needs to adjust its practices in Angola and similar practices that it engages in different parts of the world. But that was definitely a very nice way to get my work out there, and I strongly encourage everybody that is currently writing papers that feel they have an important topic at hand to not hesitate, because you certainly have nothing to lose when you apply to the journals to be published, and the benefits could be monumental in terms of having your work reach a wider audience and continuing that discussion on making sure we end, in my particular case with the paper, ending all forms of discrimination, and making sure we can move towards a society in which neocolonialism is truly eradicated.